"You still owe me $125, my sister said, sliding her hand out like a cashier waiting for payment. I blinked once, slow, like my eyes needed time to catch up to the audacity. The kitchen light above the table hummed faintly, and the bills on the counter looked brighter than they should have. I had just handed her the crisp 100, two 50s I'd pulled from my purse the way I always did on Fridays, because that was the agreement. A little money each week so she could keep my house clean, keep herself from feeling completely useless, keep the peace while she got her life together. My home wasn't a shelter. It wasn't a long-term plan. It was me buying my sister time. She stood there in my kitchen like the space belonged to her now, bare feet on my tile, hair piled up messily. One of my mugs in her hand, the one with the chipped rim I'd kept for years because it was comfortable to hold. She didn't sip. She just stared, the way people stare when they're about to make you feel like the unreasonable one. "What are you talking about?" I asked. She tilted her head, a tiny smile tugging at her mouth, like she was amused I didn't understand the simplest math. "The extra work." I set my purse down slowly on the chair, the leather making a soft slap against the seat. My dog, Milo, lifted his head from the rug near the back door and watched us with that worried animal look, the one that always shows up when voices sharpen. "Extra work," I repeated, tasting the words like they were spoiled. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out her phone. Her nails were freshly painted. New color, glossy, not chipped, something she had managed to afford while telling me she was broke. She tapped her screen with confidence, like she'd prepared for this conversation. "I walk Milo in the afternoon," she said. I stared at her. I walked Milo every morning. I walked him every evening. That was my rhythm, my routine. One of the only habits that kept my days from collapsing into stress and noise. The afternoon was the time he usually slept. If he moved, it was just to change spots under a sunbeam. "You take him with you," I said carefully, "when you go out." "That's walking him," she snapped back. "And I didn't even complain about it. I could have just stopped doing it, but I'm helping you." I kept my face still. I could feel my jaw tightening anyway, like my body was reacting before my mind was ready. "I never asked you to do that." She let out a laugh, short, sharp, almost offended. "That's not the point. Do you know what dog walkers charge? $25 a walk." I looked down at Milo again, like he might explain this new reality to me. He whined once, soft, and lowered his head. "5 days," she continued, tapping on her phone as if presenting evidence in court. "That's $125, on top of the 100. The number landed between us like a dirty dish on a clean table. For a second, I didn't speak. I just watched her, watched the way she stood with her shoulders squared, like she'd been waiting for a moment to claim power in a house where she had none. The anger that rose in me wasn't loud. It was cold, heavy, the kind that makes your hands steady instead of shaking. "Keeping the house clean," I said slowly, "doesn't mean inventing new jobs I didn't request." Her eyes narrowed. "That's convenient." I took one step toward the counter, not because I needed anything there, but because I needed to move my body or I felt like I'd explode. The countertop was cool under my palm. I grounded myself on it the way you ground yourself when you realize the person in front of you isn't confused. She's calculating. "And," she said, like she wasn't finished, like she'd saved the best part for last, "I made that scrapbook." My head turned back to her. "What scrapbook?" She pointed toward the living room with her phone, the way someone points toward a mess they want credit for cleaning. "The one with your letters, your papers. I organized them. I made it nice. I even looked it up on Etsy. People charge for that." My stomach tightened. I could see it in my mind instantly. My box of old letters, the ones I kept tucked away, my mother's handwriting, my father's faded postcards, documents I didn't like touching because they carried too much history. I hadn't asked her to open that box. I hadn't given her permission to handle any of it. "You went through my things," I said, and my voice sounded quieter than I expected. "It was clutter," she said, dismissing it with a flick of her wrist. "I improved it. That's $75 of work. Easy. The air in my kitchen shifted. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a place where boundaries had been crossed and then rewritten as favors. I never told you to do any of that, I said. She rolled her eyes, that old familiar teenage gesture she never outgrew. You're missing the point. You're underpaying me. All of it falls under keeping the house clean. You were ripping me off. There it was. Her turning my help into a crime. Her turning my generosity into exploitation. Her turning herself into a victim in a house she was living in for free. I stared at her long enough that she shifted her weight, like the silence was beginning to make her uncomfortable. And then I noticed something small, a folded piece of paper tucked in the back of her phone case, like a receipt, like she'd come prepared. My voice stayed even. Get your stuff. Her mouth fell open. What? Get your stuff, I repeated, louder now, sharper. You're done here. She scoffed, like I was performing. Oh my God, over money? This isn't about money, I said, and the sentence came out like stone. It's about you thinking you can bill me for touching my life like it's a service. She stepped closer, eyes bright, angry, the way she always got when she wanted a fight. You think you're so much better than me because you have this big house and your little routines. You don't even appreciate what I do. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her. I just reached into the drawer by the sink, pulled out the spare key ring I kept there, and set it on the table between us. The clink of metal was louder than it should have been. Leave the key, I said. Her face changed, quick. Not guilt, not regret. Something harder. Something like panic trying to hide behind rage. You can't just throw me out, she hissed. I can, I said, and I am. Milo stood up and paced once, nails clicking on tile. My sister glanced at him like he was judging her, too. She snatched the key ring off the table and threw it down again, like returning it was an insult. Fine, fine. Enjoy your perfect little life. I walked past her without touching her, opened the front door, and the cold air rushed in like a clean slap. She stood there for a second, frozen in the doorway's light, and then she turned and stormed down the front steps, muttering under her breath. I followed her to the threshold not to chase her, just to make sure she actually left. I watched her cross the driveway, shoulders hunched, phone clenched tight in her hand. And right before she reached the sidewalk, she stopped, turned back, and held up her phone with that folded paper still tucked behind it. You're going to regret this, she said, and her smile didn't reach her eyes, because I kept track of everything. The house didn't feel empty after she left. It felt rearranged, like furniture had been dragged a few inches out of alignment, and my body kept bumping into where things used to be. I stood in the doorway long after her footsteps disappeared, the cold creeping up through my shoes. Milo pressed against my leg, warm and confused, tail wagging once before stilling. I closed the door slowly and locked it, the sound too final, too loud. Inside, the silence had weight. The refrigerator hummed. The clock over the stove clicked forward 1 second at a time. I picked up the $100 bill she'd refused to take and folded it back into my wallet, my fingers stiff like they belonged to someone else. I didn't cry. Not then. I walked through the living room, noticing things I hadn't before. A throw pillow slightly out of place, one of my books on the wrong shelf. The scrapbook sat on the coffee table where she'd left it, thick and smug, tied with a ribbon I didn't own. I didn't open it. I carried it to the hall closet and set it on the top shelf, behind winter coats. The door made a dull thud when I shut it, and I rested my forehead against the wood for a moment longer than necessary. That night, my phone buzzed twice. I ignored it both times. By morning, the quiet had changed. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was pressure. At the grocery store, I ran into Mrs. Calder from 2 houses down. She stood close in the aisle, cart blocking mine, smiling too tightly. Your sister left in a hurry last night, she said, glancing around like she expected an audience. Everything okay? Yes, I said. One word. Clean. Mrs. Calder nodded slowly, eyes sharp. She seemed upset. I didn't respond. I picked up a loaf of bread and moved past her cart. As I walked away, I felt her gaze follow me like a fingertip pressed between my shoulder blades. By noon, my phone lit up again. This time, I looked. A message from my sister. "You owe me for the work I did. I have records." I set the phone down on the counter without replying. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight, like someone had cinched a belt around my ribs. An hour later, another message arrived. "I talked to a lawyer friend. You can't just evict someone like that." I let Milo out into the backyard and watched him sniff the fence line, his tail moving back and forth in a calm, unbothered rhythm. The winter sun was thin, pale, casting long shadows across the grass, warm light on my face, temporary safety. The phone buzzed again. "And you underpaid me." I muted her number. The relief was brief. By evening, the pressure seeped in from other places. My cousin called, her voice soft but edged with accusation. "Your sister's really struggling. She said you kicked her out without warning." "That's not what happened," I said. There was a pause. Too long. "She said you humiliated her. Over money." I ended the call before my voice could change. The next day, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly typed. A list. Dog walking, $125, organizing personal documents, $75 household labor discrepancy, $200 total due $400. At the bottom, in my sister's handwriting, was a note. "Please remit payment within 7 days." My hands trembled once. Just once. Then they stilled. I folded the paper carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter beside my bills. The overhead light felt harsher than usual, exposing every crease, every smudge. Judgment light. I told myself not to respond. I told myself this would pass. I told myself I'd done nothing wrong. That night, I woke to Milo growling low in his sleep. I lay there listening to the house settle, every sound magnified. Somewhere between the ticking clock and my own breathing, I felt watched, not by eyes but by expectations, the kind that gather quietly and wait. The following afternoon, I came home to find my sister's car parked across the street. My stomach dropped. She wasn't alone. 2 women stood with her on the sidewalk, arms crossed, faces tight with sympathy. One of them I recognized, our aunt. The other I didn't know. I didn't get out of the car right away. I sat there, engine ticking, seatbelt still across my chest. Milo whined softly beside me. My sister saw me first. Her face lit up with something like triumph. "She's home," she said loudly. I stepped out of the car and closed the door behind me. The air felt colder than it should have. Clouded light. No warmth. "You can't do this," my aunt said before I'd even reached them. "Family doesn't treat family this way." "I asked her to leave," I said. "She crossed boundaries." My sister laughed, a brittle sound. "Boundaries? You mean when I worked for you and you refused to pay?" The unfamiliar woman stepped forward. "She has documentation," she said, like that settled everything. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I unlocked my front door and went inside, my heart pounding hard enough to make my ears ring. I heard them outside for another minute, voices rising then falling. Before the car doors slammed, I locked the door again. That evening, I found a post on social media, not tagged, but familiar words. Sometimes the people who claim to help you are the ones exploiting you the most. Comments piled underneath, sad faces, angry ones. Family members chimed in, people who hadn't spoken to me in years. I closed the app. The next morning, a letter arrived from a mediation service. My sister's name listed neatly at the top, a request to resolve a financial dispute. My hands finally shook. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd held out her hand and told me I owed her. The light above flickered once, then steadied. Milo rested his chin on my knee. I realized then that she wasn't done. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't backing down. She was escalating. And as I stared at the paper in front of me, I understood that whatever she'd been keeping track of, She was about to use it against me. I wasn't always the woman with a quiet house and a predictable Friday routine. There were years when my life felt like a series of shifts I never clocked out of, one responsibility bleeding into the next without pause. I grew up learning how to be useful before I learned how to be seen. My mother used to say, "Do the work in front of you." And I took that sentence like a vow. It followed me from childhood into every version of adulthood I lived through. When things needed fixing, I fixed them. When someone needed covering, I covered. When silence was required, I swallowed my words and made room. My sister was always different, louder, hungrier. She took up space without apology. When we were girls, she'd scatter her things across the bedroom floor, clothes, notebooks, loose change, and step over the mess like it wasn't hers. I'd pick it up not because she asked, but because the disorder made my chest tighten. Even then, I learned the pattern. She moved forward and I followed behind, smoothing the ground. After high school, I went straight into work. No gap year, no wandering. I took the first office job that would have me, file clerk, minimum pay, no benefits, and wore the same navy cardigan every day until the elbows thinned. I kept my first employee badge long after it stopped working. The plastic cracked at one corner, my name faded but still legible. It lived in the back of a drawer, a reminder of who I had to become to survive. I married young. Not for romance, at least not only for that, but for stability. My husband was kind in the way quiet men often are, dependable and predictable. Together we built something that looked solid from the outside. A modest house, shared bills, routines that didn't frighten the neighbors. I worked 2 jobs for years, mornings in an office, evenings at a retail counter, my badge from one swinging against my hip while I wore the uniform of the other. I learned how to stretch dollars until they went thin. I learned how to calculate groceries down to the cent. I learned how to say no to myself so other people could say yes. My sister drifted in and out of my life during all of it, always with a story, always between things. She borrowed money with a laugh, promised repayment like it was a joke we both understood. I kept track quietly, not to confront her, but because numbers gave me control when feelings didn't. When my marriage ended, no drama, just erosion, I didn't collapse. I downsized my life, not my standards. I took on more responsibility at work. I earned my promotions the slow way by being reliable when others burned out. The badge changed. The title changed. The work stayed the same. There were nights I came home so tired I sat in my car with the engine off, forehead against the steering wheel, breathing until the world felt manageable again. I didn't call anyone. I didn't ask for help. I learned how to carry myself through exhaustion without dropping anything. My sister never learned that skill. She moved from couch to couch, job to job, city to city. Each time she landed somewhere new, she sounded hopeful. Each time it fell apart, she sounded wronged. When our mother died, the old patterns returned sharper than before. I handled the paperwork. I organized the funeral. I answered the phone calls from distant relatives who needed reassurance more than information. My sister cried loudly, collapsed dramatically, demanded attention like oxygen. After the burial, she hugged me hard and whispered, "I don't know how you do it." I didn't answer because I didn't know either. Years later, when I finally bought this house, the one with enough space to feel like air, I allowed myself a small celebration. New paint, new locks, a garden I planted slowly, deliberately, choosing perennials that didn't need constant attention. The dog came later, a rescue, a quiet companion who matched my pace. I kept working. I kept saving. I kept my routines tight. The badge drawer moved with me, always unpacked last, like a talisman. When my sister called asking for a place to stay, I said no first. That part matters. I said no and meant it. But then she cried. She said she had nowhere else. She said it would be temporary. She said she'd do anything to contribute. I remembered our mother's voice. Do the work in front of you. I told myself it would be different this time. I told myself boundaries could exist alongside kindness. I told myself I was strong enough now to help without being pulled under. Letting her in felt like reopening a chapter I thought I'd closed, but I did it anyway. I cleared the guest room. I laid out rules. I put timelines in writing. I treated it like a contract because that was the only language I trusted. At first, she followed them. Mostly. She cleaned. She smiled. She said thank you. She asked about my job, my routines, my dog. She watched me closely, the way people do when they're studying how something works. One afternoon, I came home to find my old employee badge sitting on the dining table. I hadn't taken it out. I knew that instantly. "What's this?" she asked, holding it between two fingers. "Nothing," I said. "Just something I kept." She turned it over, squinting at my name. "You're weird about stuff." I took it from her and put it back in the drawer. My hand lingered there longer than usual. The small things started shifting after that. My sister began narrating her actions, pointing out what she did, framing favors as efforts. I noticed, but I didn't address it, not yet. There was a morning when I overheard her on the phone, voice low, saying, "She's lucky to have me. She'd fall apart without help." I froze in the hallway, breath caught halfway out of my chest. She didn't see me. The silence that followed burned hotter than if she had. I didn't confront her then. I told myself I was tired. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I told myself I'd deal with it later. Later has a way of arriving fully formed. Looking back now, I see how the groundwork was laid long before she ever held out her hand and told me I owed her. The entitlement didn't appear overnight. It grew quietly, fed by my silence, watered by my history of doing the work without complaint. That's the truth I didn't want to face. I sat alone at my kitchen table that evening, the drawer with my old badge closed tight, the house still and expectant, and for the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar coil in my stomach. Not fear, not guilt, but the uneasy sense that the rules I lived by were about to be used against me. The mediation letter sat on my counter like it belonged there, like it had always been part of my kitchen. I moved around it carefully, as if touching it might trigger something I wasn't ready to face. Coffee brewed, Milo ate. The day tried to behave like any other, but the air in the house felt wrong, too still, too alert. By the time I left for work, my phone had already chimed twice. I didn't look. I slipped it into my bag and drove with the radio off. My thoughts kept company only by the sound of tires on pavement. At the office, I caught my reflection in the elevator mirror. Shoulders straight, mouth neutral, eyes a little dull. The fluorescent lights above flattened everything, turning skin pale and shadows sharp. I looked like someone who could handle a dispute calmly, someone reasonable. That illusion lasted until lunch. I stepped outside to eat on a bench near the building, the winter air biting just enough to feel awake. Halfway through my sandwich, my phone vibrated, a voicemail notification from an unknown number. I pressed play before I could stop myself. "Hi," my sister's voice said, sugary and careful. "This is just a document that I attempted to resolve things amicably. I don't want this to get ugly, but I'm prepared if it does." I stared at the concrete beneath my feet. A crack ran through it, thin but determined, splitting the surface cleanly in two. She continued. "I kept notes, dates, hours. I was generous with my estimates, actually. You should be grateful." The message ended with a soft click. I didn't move for a long time. People passed. Laughter drifted by. Somewhere nearby, a delivery truck hissed as it parked. The world kept going, indifferent to the fact that my own sister had turned my kindness into leverage. That afternoon, an email came through from mediation, copying both of us. My sister had submitted her documentation. There were spreadsheets, rows of dates, tasks described in inflated language, canine exercise management, archival organization, domestic maintenance beyond scope. I felt heat creep up my neck. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, wanting to correct, to clarify, to expose the exaggeration line by line. I didn't. I closed the email and sat back, my chair creaking under my weight. The silence in my office was complete, too complete. I realized I was holding my breath. At home that evening, I found the front porch light on. I hadn't left it that way. Inside, the house smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. The living room rug was vacuumed into neat lines I didn't make. The kitchen counters gleamed. It looked staged, performed. My chest tightened. On the dining table lay another envelope, this one handwritten. My sister's slanted script was unmistakable. I didn't open it right away. I set my bag down, took off my coat, washed my hands. The water ran too hot, reddening my skin. When I finally unfolded the paper, the words inside were casual, almost affectionate. I just want what's fair. I know you don't mean to take advantage of me. Let's handle this like adults. The implication sat between the lines like a dare. I folded the note and placed it beside the mediation letter, 2 pieces of paper, suddenly equal in weight, both demanding something from me. That night, I dreamed I was back in my childhood bedroom, picking clothes off the floor that never seemed to disappear. I woke with my heart racing, the sheets tangled around my legs, Milo pressed against me, warm and solid. I rested my hand on his back and waited for my breathing to slow. In the morning, my sister posted again. This time, she named me without tagging. Some people think generosity excuses exploitation. It doesn't. The comments were worse than before. Strangers weighed in. Family members I hadn't heard from in years chimed with vague disappointment. One wrote, "Money changes people." I felt something inside me collapse. Not loudly, not all at once, but like a ceiling giving way under slow, relentless pressure. At work, my concentration slipped. I misfiled a report, forgot a meeting. A coworker asked if I was okay, her voice gentle but cautious. I nodded and smiled and returned to my screen, the harsh overhead lights reflecting off it like judgment. That evening, I found my sister waiting at the end of my driveway. I stopped the car short, my foot slamming the brake harder than necessary. She stood there with her arms folded, coat too thin for the cold, chin lifted in challenge. For a moment, I couldn't make myself open the door. When I did, the cold rushed in, sharp and punishing. "You can't just ignore this," she said before I'd even shut the car. "That's childish." "I asked you to leave," I said. My voice sounded far away. "And now you're refusing to pay for work performed," she replied smoothly. "That's a different issue." A neighbor's porch light flicked on across the street. I felt suddenly exposed, like the whole block was listening. "I didn't ask you to do those things," I said. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You benefited from them. That counts." I searched her face for something familiar, regret, hesitation, anything, but found only certainty, the kind that comes from rehearsing your own version of events until it replaces the truth. "I went through your letters," she added, almost gently. "Do you know how personal that was for me? I had to process a lot." My stomach lurched. "You violated my privacy," I said. She shrugged. "You left them out." They weren't out. They had never been out. The words stuck in my throat, heavy and useless. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. My hands trembled just slightly, and I curled them into fists to hide it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said finally. "Just pay me." Something in me went still, not calm, not peaceful. Just blank. "Leave," I said. Her smile returned, thin and sharp. "You'll hear from my representative." She walked away before I could respond, heels clicking against the pavement, each step a small, deliberate wound. Inside the house, I leaned against the door after locking it, my breath shallow. The quiet pressed in, suffocating. I slid down until I was sitting on the floor, my back against the wood, Milo nudging my knee with his nose. I stayed there until the shaking passed. The next days blurred together. More emails, more messages, a formal notice scheduling mediation. My sister's tone grew colder, more professional, like she'd shed the last pretense of family. At one point, I received a list of witnesses she intended to bring. Names jumped out at me. Our aunt, a former friend, someone I barely recognized. people willing to vouch for her narrative without knowing mine. I felt smaller with every line I read. One evening, I opened the hall closet to get my coat and caught sight of the scrapbook on the top shelf. The ribbon was slightly askew. I hadn't touched it since I put it there. My chest tightened. I reached up, pulled it down, and sat on the floor beneath the hanging coats. The pages were heavy, overstuffed. Letters rearranged, margins annotated in my sister's handwriting, interpreting moments she hadn't lived through. My mother's words were there, stripped of context, repackaged as decoration. A sound escaped my throat before I could stop it. Not a sob, just air, forced out, like something had finally cracked. I closed the book and pressed my palm against the cover, grounding myself in its weight. For a moment, I wanted to disappear, to give in, to pay whatever she demanded just to make it stop. That thought scared me more than anything else, because it meant she was winning. I placed the scrapbook back on the shelf, higher this time, and shut the closet door with care. My hands were still shaking when my phone buzzed again. A new message. From Mediation. Please confirm your attendance. Your sister has submitted additional materials. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together, and realized I was standing at the edge of something I could no longer avoid. The snap didn't come with shouting or tears. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. I was standing in the copy room at work, waiting for the machine to finish humming through another stack of papers. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. The smell of warm toner hung in the air. Ordinary. Forgettable. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I almost ignored it. Almost. When I looked, I saw the preview of an email from Mediation. Subject line neutral. Polite, professional. Attached, supplemental documentation. My sister's name sat beneath it like a signature carved into stone. I didn't open it right away. I finished collecting my copies. I straightened the pages. I walked back to my desk and sat down as if nothing had changed. My coworkers typed and laughed and sipped coffee around me, unaware that something inside my chest had shifted position. Then I opened the attachment. It wasn't just spreadsheets this time. It was screenshots, messages taken out of context, photos of my living room while she'd stayed there, framed to suggest neglect, a picture of Milo asleep on the couch, time-stamped in the afternoon, labeled, evidence of routine canine exercise provided by claimant. My jaw tightened. Further down, there were excerpts from my mother's letters, the same ones from the scrapbook, cropped, annotated, interpreted in a voice that wasn't mine. Claimant provided emotional labor by organizing and contextualizing family correspondence. My hands went cold. This wasn't about money anymore. It hadn't been for a while, but seeing my private history flattened into bullet points made it undeniable. She wasn't just trying to get paid, she was trying to rewrite who I was. I scrolled slowly, deliberately, forcing myself not to rush. Each line landed like a small shove, pushing me toward a familiar place, the one where I gave in, smoothed things over, absorbed the damage so everyone else could stay comfortable. I felt the pull of it, the old reflex. Just pay her, make it stop, be the reasonable one. The copy machine behind me clicked and went silent. The room felt suddenly too bright, too exposed. I closed the document and locked my screen. For a moment, I sat very still. Then something unexpected happened. I laughed. It was soft, brief. A single breath pushed out of my nose. Not humor, recognition. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. I stood up and went to the restroom, locking myself into the far stall. The tile was cold under my shoes. I rested my forehead against the metal divider and closed my eyes. I thought of the employee badge in my drawer at home. The years I'd spent documenting my own work quietly, carefully, without needing applause. I thought of contracts I'd written, budgets I'd managed, processes I'd followed to the letter. I realized something simple and sharp. I knew how systems worked, and she was counting on me for getting that. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't mediation. It was a message from my sister. I sent them everything. I'm being fair. Don't make this worse. My hands didn't shake when I typed back, "Do not contact me directly again. All communication goes through mediation." I stared at the message for a second before sending it. Then I did. The moment it went through, a strange calm settled over me. Not relief, not peace, just clarity. That evening, I didn't collapse onto the couch like I had the nights before. I took off my coat, hung it up properly, and opened the hall drawer where I kept old files, tax returns, insurance papers, things I rarely needed but never threw away. I pulled everything out and laid it across the dining table. The overhead light cast sharp shadows across the wood. Harsh, unforgiving. It reminded me of interrogation rooms I'd only seen on television, where nothing was allowed to hide. I worked slowly, methodically. I found the written agreement I'd typed when my sister moved in. Dates, conditions, weekly payment amount, duration. I'd made her sign it. She'd laughed at the formality then, scribbling her name like it was a joke. I found bank records showing the weekly transfers, consistent, labeled, clean. I opened my email and searched her name. Dozens of messages appeared, her requests, her thank yous, her confirmations. I flagged each one. Milo lay under the table, chin on his paws, watching my feet move back and forth. The house was quiet, but this time it didn't feel oppressive. It felt focused. At one point, I reached for the scrapbook in the closet. My hand paused in midair. I didn't take it down. Not yet. Instead, I sat back in my chair and let myself feel the weight of what I was doing. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty. It was boundary, finally enforced. I thought of my sister standing in the driveway, so sure of herself, of the way she'd said she'd kept track of everything. So had I. I slept that night without dreaming. The next morning, I woke before my alarm. The house was dim, early light filtering through the curtains, soft and cool. Milo stretched and followed me into the kitchen. I brewed coffee and stood by the window while it dripped, watching the sky brighten. For the first time in weeks, my chest didn't feel tight. At work, I requested a half day. My voice was steady when I asked. No explanation given, none required. At home, I called the mediation office and confirmed my attendance. Then I did something I hadn't done since this started. I called a lawyer. Not a friend, not a favor, a professional. I explained the situation plainly. No drama, no embellishment. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. "She doesn't have much of a case," the lawyer said carefully, "but she's being aggressive." "I can handle aggressive," I replied. After the call, I sat alone at the kitchen table again. The same spot, same chair. But the papers in front of me were different now. Organized, categorized, controlled. The scrapbook remained in the closet, untouched but no longer heavy in my mind. Just another object, another piece of evidence waiting its turn. My phone buzzed one last time that day, a notification from mediation. "Your sister has requested an in-person session and indicated she will be bringing physical materials." I read the line twice. Then I closed the message, took a slow breath, and reached for a fresh folder. The preparation didn't feel dramatic. It felt clinical. I bought a new folder on my way home from work, thick and plain, the kind meant to disappear into filing cabinets. No color, no label, just something to hold weight without comment. I placed it at the center of the dining table and began deciding what belonged inside it. I started with dates. I wrote them down by hand first, even though everything existed digitally. The act of writing steadied me. Week 1, week 2, the day she moved in, the day she signed the agreement, the Friday I handed her cash and she slid her hand back out, asking for more. My handwriting surprised me. It was calm, even, no slant from anger. I opened my laptop and pulled up bank records. Each transfer sat there like a quiet witness, unbothered by emotion. Same amount, same day, every week. I printed them and stacked the pages neatly, aligning the edges until they formed a clean block. Next came emails. I didn't read them all again. I scanned for confirmations, acknowledgments, the casual thanks. she'd typed without thinking it might matter. I highlighted nothing. I let the words speak for themselves. At some point, Milo nudged my knee with his nose, impatient. I took him outside, walked the yard once, let him sniff and circle. The air was cold, sharp enough to wake me fully. When we came back in, I wiped my boots carefully on the mat and returned to the table. I called my cousin, the same one who'd questioned me days earlier. My voice stayed measured as I explained the mediation, the claims, the documents my sister had submitted. I didn't defend myself. I didn't accuse. There was a long pause on the line. "She didn't tell me any of that," my cousin said finally. "I know," I replied. Another pause. Then quieter. "If they ask, I'll tell them what I saw." I thanked her and ended the call before relief could soften my focus. The next call was harder. Our aunt, the one who'd stood in my driveway. I expected resistance. I got hesitation instead. "She's always had trouble with follow-through," my aunt admitted, like she was confessing something shameful, but she sounded convincing. "I'm not asking you to take sides," I said. "I'm asking you to tell the truth if you're asked." Silence stretched between us, uncomfortable and heavy. "I will," she said at last, "if they ask." That was enough. I added a small note to the folder. Names, phone numbers, no commentary. The scrapbook stayed in the closet. I could feel it there, like a held breath. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I focused on what my sister had misunderstood most about me. My patience wasn't confusion. My silence wasn't surrender. It was observation. Over the next few days, I noticed details I might have missed before. The way mediation emails copied her on everything, how quickly she responded, how her tone shifted depending on who was included. Friendly when officials were present, sharp when she thought she had the upper hand. I printed those too. One afternoon, while filing papers, I came across the old agreement again. Her signature looked smaller than I remembered, rushed, like she'd wanted it over with. I traced the date with my finger and felt something settle in my chest. I remembered the way she'd laughed when she signed it, the way she'd said, "You're so formal," like it was a flaw. That laugh echoed differently now. The lawyer called midweek. We spoke briefly. He confirmed timelines, asked clarifying questions, requested copies. His voice was neutral, uninterested in drama. "She's trying to inflate implied consent," he said. "That's not going to hold." "Good," I replied. After the call, I sat alone for a moment, hands folded in my lap, not thinking, just breathing. That night, I finally took the scrapbook down from the closet. I didn't sit. I stood at the table and opened it carefully, like it might bite. The ribbon slid loose easily. Inside, the pages were thick, overloaded. Letters mounted at angles that felt wrong. Notes scribbled in the margins. Interpretations, conclusions, assumptions. My mother's handwriting looked smaller somehow, crowded by commentary. I didn't read everything. I flipped through slowly, marking pages with small tabs, not out of sentiment, out of necessity. When I reached the back, something unexpected fell out. A folded sheet. My sister's handwriting. It was a list, dates, tasks. The same language from her spreadsheets, but messier, less polished. Practice. I stared at it for a long time. This wasn't documentation after the fact. This was premeditation. My hand trembled once. I pressed my palm flat against the table until it stopped. I placed the paper into the folder without comment. The night before mediation, I laid everything out one final time. The folder sat closed, centered, unassuming. My notes were minimal. No speeches, no arguments rehearsed, just facts arranged in order. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt like myself, not armor, not apology. Milo watched from the doorway as I slipped on my coat. I knelt to scratch behind his ears, grounding myself in the familiar weight of him. At the mediation office, the waiting room was quiet. Neutral art on the walls, soft chairs arranged too far apart. I sat and placed the folder on my lap, hands resting lightly on top. My sister arrived late. She swept in with confidence, carrying a tote bag that bulged at the seams. She didn't look at me. Not at first. When she did, her smile was thin, practiced. "Ready to settle this?" she asked, loud enough for the receptionist to hear. I didn't answer. We were led into a small room with a long table, bright overhead lights, no shadows, no hiding. The mediator introduced himself, explained the process, invited my sister to present her materials. She stood immediately. She laid out her documents with flourish, printed spreadsheets, photos, screenshots, the scrapbook, placed carefully in the center like an offering. "I've been patient," she said, voice steady. "I just want what I'm owed." The mediator nodded and turned to me. "Your response?" I opened my folder. "Not yet, not fully. I have documentation," I said simply. I slid one page forward, then another. I didn't rush. I didn't narrate. My sister's smile faltered, just slightly. The mediator leaned in, reading. His brow furrowed. He flipped to the next page on his own. The room felt very still. I watched my sister's fingers curl tighter around her pen, watched her posture shift, defensive now instead of performative. She cleared her throat. "Those emails don't show—" The mediator held up a hand. "We'll go through everything in order." I sat back, hands folded again, and waited. Because I knew something she didn't. She had brought everything she thought mattered, and I had brought everything that did. The mediator moved slowly, methodically, like someone who understood the power of pacing. He started at the beginning. Dates, signatures, terms. The written agreement slid across the table, stopping in front of him with a soft whisper of paper against laminate. He adjusted his glasses and read it once, then again, more carefully. My sister shifted in her chair. "That was just a formality," she said lightly. "We're family." The mediator didn't look up. "It specifies compensation, weekly, fixed amount." "Yes, but—" He raised his eyes then. Not unkind, just firm. "Let me finish." Silence settled over the room, heavy and public. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, unforgiving. I felt the weight of them on my shoulders, but I didn't shrink. I kept my hands folded in my lap, nails pressed lightly into my palms to stay present. He moved to the bank records next. The stack was neat, aligned. He flipped through them one by one, his finger tracing dates. "Payments were made consistently," he said. "Same amount, same interval." My sister leaned forward. "That doesn't account for the additional labor." He nodded once, acknowledging the claim without accepting it. "We'll get there." She exhaled sharply, crossed her arms, and leaned back. The confidence she'd carried in with her was thinning, like fabric pulled too tight. When the mediator reached the emails, he paused. "These messages," he said, glancing between us, "are contemporaneous?" "Yes," I replied. My voice sounded steady even to me. He read aloud one line, then another. Her words, casual, grateful, confirming receipt of payment, no mention of dissatisfaction, no request for renegotiation. My sister's foot tapped under the table, once, twice, then stopped. "That doesn't mean I wasn't doing more," she said, her tone sharper now. "I didn't realize at the time that I was being taken advantage of." The mediator tilted his head slightly. "Taken advantage of how?" She straightened, ready. "I provided additional services, dog walking, emotional labor, organizational work." He turned to me. "Did you request these services?" "No," I said. "Did you authorize them?" "No." My sister scoffed. "That's ridiculous. She benefited from them." The mediator nodded, thoughtful. "Benefit alone doesn't establish obligation." My sister opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her fingers tightened around the pen until her knuckles went pale. The mediator gestured toward the tote bag. "Let's look at the physical materials." She reached for it quickly, too quickly, and pulled out the scrapbook. Set it in front of him like proof of devotion. "I organized deeply personal materials," she said. "That took time, emotional energy." The mediator untied the ribbon carefully. He flipped through a few pages, brow creasing. "These letters," he said slowly, "belong to my sister," she cut in. "But their family history." He looked up at her. "Were you given permission to alter or repurpose them?" She hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "They were left out." "They were stored," I said quietly. The mediator glanced at me, then back at her. He continued flipping pages until one of the tabs I'd placed caught his eye. He slid the page out gently. It was my mother's letter, the one my sister had annotated heavily. Her handwriting crowded the margins, interpreting, reframing, assigning motives. "This," the mediator said, tapping the page once, "appears to be commentary added by you." "Yes," my sister said. "Context." He leaned back in his chair. The lights reflected off his glasses, hiding his eyes for a moment. "I'm going to ask a direct question," he said. "Were these materials ever discussed as compensated work prior to your dispute?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "No," she admitted. The word landed hard. The mediator nodded and turned the page again. That's when the folded paper slipped out. He caught it before it fell to the floor. "What's this?" he asked. My sister's face drained of color. He unfolded it slowly. His eyes moved across the page. His mouth tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone who'd just seen behind the curtain. "This appears to be a list," he said. "Dates, tasks, estimated values." She swallowed. "I was just keeping track." He looked up. "When was this written?" She didn't answer. He turned the paper over. There was a date at the top. Weeks before the first complaint. Weeks before the confrontation. Weeks before she ever asked me for more money. The room went very still. The mediator placed the paper on the table between us, aligning it carefully with the other documents. "This suggests intent," he said, "not retroactive realization." My sister shook her head quickly. "You're misunderstanding. I was just trying to be fair." He met her gaze evenly. "Fairness requires transparency." Her voice rose. "She's wealthy. She can afford it." The mediator didn't flinch. Ability to pay does not create obligation. She turned to me then, eyes flashing. "You're really going to do this? Over a few $100s?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "This was never about the money," I said. The mediator held up a hand again, stopping her response before it could form. "I've seen enough," he said. He gathered the documents into two piles, one neat, one disordered. The contrast was stark. "Based on the agreement, the payment records, and the lack of prior authorization," he continued, "there is no basis for additional compensation." My sister let out a short, incredulous laugh. "So that's it? She just gets away with exploiting me?" The mediator's voice sharpened just slightly. "There is no evidence of exploitation here." Her chair scraped loudly as she stood. "This is biased." "Sit down," he said, calm but firm. She didn't. Instead, she pointed at the folder in front of me. "She planned this. She always does. She keeps everything. She makes herself look innocent." I felt the room tilt toward me, every eye suddenly waiting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. "I keep records," I said, "because I've learned what happens when I don't." The mediator nodded once. He turned back to her. "This mediation is concluded." "What?" she snapped. "There will be no settlement," he said, "and I would caution you against pursuing this further." Her breath came fast now. "You can't just—" "I can," he replied, "and I have." She grabbed the scrapbook, shoving papers back into her bag with shaking hands. The confidence was gone completely now, replaced by something raw and exposed. As she stood there, breathing hard, I noticed something small. Her pen had rolled off the table and onto the floor. She didn't pick it up. The mediator looked at me. "Do you have anything further to add?" I shook my head. "No," I said, "I don't." He nodded and stood, signaling the end. My sister laughed again, too loud, too brittle. You think you've won?" I met her eyes. "I think this is over." She stared at me for a long second, searching for something, remorse maybe, or weakness. She found neither. She turned and walked out without another word. The door closed behind her with a solid, final sound. The mediator gathered his papers and offered me a polite smile. "You handled that well." I didn't answer. I just stood, picked up my folder, and felt the weight of it in my hands, lighter now, emptied of threat. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. My hands rested on my lap, still, steady. For the first time since this began, the silence didn't feel like pressure. It felt like space. The house welcomed me back without ceremony. No tension waiting in the corners, no unfinished conversations hanging in the air, just the familiar click of the lock, the soft thud of my bag on the chair, Milo's nails tapping once before he leaned into my leg. I stood in the entryway longer than necessary, letting the quiet settle around me. It wasn't the heavy silence I'd been living with for weeks. This one felt earned, like the pause after something finally stops pushing against you. I put the folder on the dining table and didn't open it again. I didn't need to. Its work was done. That evening, I cooked for myself. Nothing elaborate. Soup simmering gently, steam fogging the window above the sink. The light in the kitchen was warm, forgiving. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting my body catch up to my mind. Milo lay nearby, chin on the floor, watching every step like it mattered. My phone buzzed once. A message notification. I looked at the screen. My sister's name flashed briefly before disappearing. Blocked. Gone. I set the phone face down and didn't feel guilty. Not even a flicker. Later, I took the scrapbook down from the closet one last time. I sat at the table and untied the ribbon, my fingers careful but no longer hesitant. I flipped through the pages slowly, removing her annotations, sliding my mother's letters free from their forced frames. I didn't rush. I didn't reread everything. I let the paper speak without commentary. When I finished, I placed the letters back into a simple box. No decoration, no performance, just storage, just truth. The scrapbook itself went into the trash. The sound it made landing there was dull and unremarkable, exactly as it should have been. In the days that followed, the world adjusted. Quietly. People stopped calling. The social posts faded into the background noise of things that never mattered as much as they pretended to. No apologies came. None were needed. My sister didn't reach out again. I changed the locks anyway, not out of fear, out of clarity. At work, I focused better, slept deeper, laughed once at something small and unexpected, and realized it didn't feel forced. The tension I'd been carrying had loosened its grip, leaving behind a tiredness that felt honest instead of draining. One afternoon, I opened the drawer and took out my old employee badge. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the cracked plastic, the faded letters. For years, it had reminded me of endurance, of surviving quietly, of doing the work no one noticed. I didn't put it back this time. I set it on my desk instead, not as proof of sacrifice, but as proof of competence, of consistency, of knowing exactly who I am when someone tries to tell me otherwise. That night, I sat on the porch with Milo at my feet, the air cool and clean. The street was quiet. Lights glowed softly behind windows, lives continuing, unbothered by the storm that had passed through mine. I realized something then that settled deep and stayed. Helping someone doesn't mean surrendering yourself. Silence doesn't obligate you to accept distortion. And family isn't measured by who demands the most, but by who respects the truth when it's spoken. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, breathing in the calm. The house behind me felt solid again. Mine. If you stayed with me this long, thank you. When I think of those old letters, once handled like leverage, now resting quietly where they belong, I understand something I didn't before. Pain can be rearranged. Meaning can be reclaimed. And sometimes sharing a story is how we remember we're not alone in learning that.